Tonight, we uncover a secret buried so deeply beneath history that even whispering it once cost people their lives. A truth the Vatican did not deny or destroy, but quietly rewrote. A story of radiant beings older than Scripture itself, beings of light who walked beside humanity long before the Church claimed its throne. These were not monsters, they were teachers, they were guardians. They were the ones ancient civilizations called the Shining Ones. And yet somewhere in the shadows of time, the Vatican turned them into something else. They rebranded them as demons. They twisted their names, erased their stories, and hid the evidence in vaults so heavily guarded that even popes feared to open them. Because if humanity ever remembered who these beings truly were, everything would change. The origin of knowledge, the foundations of faith, the story of heaven and earth itself, all of it would crack open. So before we step into this forbidden history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. What you are about to hear is one of the oldest secrets on the planet, and once you see the truth behind the fallen angels, you cannot unsee it. Something strange happened in history, something so quiet and so subtle that most people never realized it even took place. A single word changed shape, changed meaning, and eventually changed the way entire civilizations understood the unseen world around them. That word is demon. Today, when people hear it, they imagine twisted monsters with wings of darkness and eyes filled with fire. But that image is not ancient. It is not original. It was not even the belief of the earliest religions on earth. It was crafted, shaped, and polished over centuries until the world forgot what came before. And the truth hiding behind that forgotten meaning may be far more unsettling than anything painted in medieval manuscripts. In ancient times, long before the Vatican existed, and long before the Bible was even written, many cultures spoke of shining ones. They were described as radiant beings from the sky, beings of knowledge and power. They were not monsters or creatures of fear, but teachers. Some were even honored as guardians who walked between the realm of the divine and the world of humankind. These were the beings later called fallen angels and watchers. And the strange part is that the oldest stories never described them as demons at all. The word demon originally came from an ancient term that meant a wise spirit or a guiding force. Not evil, not corrupt, not monstrous. So how did a word that once pointed to wisdom become the symbol of darkness itself? To answer that, we have to step into a time of collapsing empires and rising power. When Rome fell in the 5th century, the world entered a long era where the most powerful voice in Europe was the Church. And that voice did not always seek to explain. Sometimes it sought to erase. The early Church Fathers were confronted with ancient stories from cultures older than theirs, stories of radiant beings who descended to earth and gave humans knowledge. These tales came from Sumer, from Babylon, from Greece, and from early Hebrew writings, including the strange and mysterious Book of Enoch. In that book, the Watchers are described as angels who descended to teach humanity everything from astronomy to metalwork. They brought wisdom, not terror. They were shining, not monstrous. But to a growing religious authority, this created a dangerous problem. If ancient knowledge came from beings outside the Church, then the Church did not control the source of truth. If heavenly beings could act on their own, then spiritual authority did not belong only to priests. And if the Watchers had once guided humanity, then what did that make the institution that claimed to be the only gatekeeper of divine knowledge? Slowly, the story began to shift. Over the centuries, the Watchers were rewritten, their radiance dimmed, their teachings reframed as forbidden, their rebellion painted as pure evil. And the word demon was carved into a weapon that turned ancient teachers into enemies of faith. By the time medieval Europe arrived, these beings were no longer remembered as shining ones. They were recast as twisted creatures of shadow. The transformation was complete. A single word had been rewritten, and with it, an entire chapter of human memory. But if the truth about fallen angels was reshaped once, it can be reshaped again. And the deeper we look, the more we begin to see that the war for the meaning of demon was never about monsters at all. It was about control. And what comes next may reveal just how much of our history has been rewritten in silence. Long before the Bible was written, and long before the Vatican shaped the world's ideas about heaven and hell, ancient civilizations told stories of radiant beings who came from the sky. These were not monsters or demons, or twisted spirits hiding in shadows. They were described as beings of light figures so bright that early humans believed they were looking at fragments of stars made flesh. And the strange thing is that these stories appear across cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, as if humanity all remembered the same visitors. In the lands of Sumer, which many call the birthplace of civilization, people wrote on clay tablets about powerful sky beings who descended from the heavens. They were called the Anuna and the Igigi, and they were depicted not with horns or claws, but with wings, robes, and shining halos of light. These beings taught humans how to grow crops, how to build cities, and how to understand the stars. They brought order to a world of chaos and gifted knowledge that humans could never have discovered alone. Further west, in Akkadian lore, the same pattern appears. Celestial visitors glowing with brilliance interacted with early kings and priests. They were known as watchful spirits, guardians, who moved between heaven and earth as easily as a person walks between rooms. They were powerful but also curious about humanity. And they did not come to rule through fear, but to guide through knowledge. Then in early Hebrew writings, especially the older stories that existed long before, Christianity, another group, appears the Watchers. They are described as tall, shining beings who descended to earth in the days when the world was still young. These Watchers did not simply observe humanity, they interacted with it. They taught writing and the patterns of the sky. They explained the secrets of plants and the movement of animals. Some legends say they revealed healing practices that would not appear again until many centuries later. What links all these stories is one consistent idea. The earliest humans did not fear these beings. They respected them, they honored them, and they described them with the same language used for fire, lightning, and sunlight. In other words, they saw them as luminous beings from above. But over time, something changed. As new religions rose to power, older beliefs were pushed aside. What was once described as guidance became forbidden knowledge. What was once seen as a gift became labelled as temptation. And those radiant beings of ancient memory were slowly rewritten into symbols of rebellion and danger. The strange part is that the oldest texts show no sign of fear at all. Instead, they show awe. The stories feel less like warnings and more like memories of a time when humans were visited by teachers who came from the stars. So when later religious powers tried to reshape these beings into monsters, they were not just rewriting myth, they were rewriting humanity's oldest encounters with the unknown. And the deeper we look, the more it becomes clear that the beings of light who once walked among early civilizations did not fit the later image of demons. They were something far more mysterious, something far more powerful, and their story was only just beginning. When the early church began shaping its version of human history, it ran into a silent but enormous problem. Across the ancient world, there were stories, tablets, and carvings thousands of years older than Christianity that described powerful beings who came from the sky. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. Later cultures called them the Igigi, or the Shining Ones, and in early Hebrew writings they appeared again as the Watchers. These beings were not described as spirits or dreams or symbols. They were described as real. They interacted with humans. They taught humans. They walked beside kings and farmers, as if they belonged on earth just as much as in the heavens. For the early church, this created a challenge they did not know how to solve. If these ancient stories were true, then humanity had once been guided by powerful beings who were not angels from the Bible and not messengers of the Christian God. They were older, stranger, and far more involved with human civilization. Early church scholars tried to make sense of the ancient tablets being discovered throughout Mesopotamia. Some priests argued that the Anunnaki were simply false gods invented by pagans. Others believed they were fallen angels whose stories had been twisted over time. But none of these explanations fit what the ancient texts actually said. The Sumerians did not worship the Anunnaki out of fear. They described them as wise beings who brought order to the world. The Akkadians described them as heavenly observers who stepped in during moments of crisis or transformation. The early Hebrews described them as watchers sent to guide humanity, but who later crossed a forbidden boundary. These stories were too detailed, too consistent, and too widespread to dismiss as fantasy. As more ancient writings were studied, the problem grew. The Anunnaki was said to have taught humans agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy. They guided the creation of cities that rose long before Christianity existed. They were connected to the origins of writing, the movement of stars, and the shaping of laws. If all of this was true, then humanity's first teachers were not human at all. For a church that claimed to be the sole guardian of truth, this was dangerous. It suggested that long before temples and cathedrals were built, humans already had contact with celestial beings. And these beings were not described as evil. They were described as bright and wise and incredibly powerful. So early church writers began to reshape the story. They merged the shining beings of ancient civilizations with the fallen angels from early Hebrew tradition. Over time, the Anunnaki were rebranded, not as teachers, but as tempters, not as guides, but as rebels. Their gifts of knowledge were reinterpreted as forbidden secrets that led humanity astray. But the ancient texts themselves never said that. They spoke of partnership, not corruption. They spoke of guidance, not deception. And that contradiction created a shadow that followed the church for centuries. Because buried beneath layers of rewritten doctrine is a truth too large to ignore, the Anunnaki problem was never about mythology, it was about history. A history where humanity may not have been alone, and where the beings who shaped our earliest civilizations were far more complex than the demons they were later made to be. There is a reason the Book of Enoch was whispered about in secret halls and hidden away from the eyes of ordinary believers for more than 1,000 years. It did not simply tell stories, it exposed something. Something the early church could not control. Something that threatened the perfect narrative they were trying to build about angels, demons, and the origins of human knowledge. The Book of Enoch is one of the oldest and strangest writings connected to early Hebrew tradition. It was already ancient long before Christianity began, yet it describes events so powerful and so unsettling that even today scholars struggle to explain it. At the heart of the book is the story of the Watchers. These were not gentle guardian angels floating above clouds. They were described as tall, radiant beings who descended to earth in physical form. They walked among humans. They spoke to humans. They taught humans. And they broke a rule that changed the world forever. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers chose to leave their heavenly realm and step into the human story. They revealed secrets that were never meant for ordinary people. Secrets about the stars, the earth, medicine, writing, and the hidden workings of nature. They taught skills that helped humans build cities, craft tools, and understand the seasons. But the book says one thing clearly. Knowledge came before obedience. And that alone made the Watchers dangerous to those who wanted authority over the minds of the people. Even more explosive was the part of the story where the Watchers took human wives and had children called the Nephilim. These children were giants, with incredible strength and unusual abilities. They were the beings ancient cultures remembered as heroes and demigods. Their ruins and stories appear across the ancient world. All of this clashed directly with the version of history the early church wanted the world to accept. If humans learned wisdom from the Watchers, then the church was not the original guardian of truth. If angels could disobey and follow their own path, then heavenly loyalty was not as absolute as doctrine claimed. And if giants once walked the earth, then the official timeline of creation collapses completely. To protect its authority, the Vatican made a decision that shaped centuries of belief. They removed the Book of Enoch from their approved religious texts. They banned it from being read in churches. They labelled it heresy. They insisted that copying it or teaching from it was dangerous to the soul. For more than a millennium, the book survived only in fragments, hidden in remote monasteries and preserved by cultures outside of Europe. But the strange thing is this: the New Testament itself quotes the Book of Enoch, which means the early Christians accepted it. The early church fathers studied it. Only later was it declared too dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it revealed too much. The Watchers were not demons. They were not monsters. They were beings of light who changed the course of human history. And the Book of Enoch preserved their story so clearly that the only way to silence it was to bury it. Yet buried truth has a way of rising again, and this book may be the key to understanding everything the Vatican tried to hide. There is a moment in ancient history so mysterious and so powerful that later religious authorities did everything they could to twist it into a story of pure evil. According to the oldest versions of the tale, it did not begin with darkness or hatred. It began with a choice made by 200 radiant beings who looked down at the world of early humanity and decided to cross a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. The Book of Enoch describes this event with unsettling clarity. It says that in the earliest days, when humans were still young and struggling to understand the world, a group of heavenly watchers looked upon Earth with fascination. They observed how fragile humans were, and yet how curious, how full of potential, how desperate to learn. These watchers were not ghosts. They were not illusions. They were described as physical, towering beings, glowing like fire and walking like men. And they wanted to help. But helping came with a price. Their laws forbade them from interfering directly with humanity. They were meant to watch, not to guide. They were meant to observe, not to teach. The moment they stepped onto earth, they would no longer belong fully to heaven, and the ripples of that decision would reshape the future. Still, the Watchers made their choice. Led by a figure named Shemiaza, they descended upon Mount Hermon, a towering peak that touches the borders of Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. The book says the Watchers chose this place because it was remote, hidden, and sacred long before any religion claimed it. There on the mountaintop, the 200 beings made a pact. If one of them was punished, then all would stand together. No one would abandon the others. It was a promise sealed in fear and hope and rebellion. And with that, they stepped down from the heights and became part of the human world. What followed was not chaos, it was awakening. The Watchers taught humans knowledge that would normally take thousands of years to develop. They revealed the secrets of writing, the patterns of the stars, the understanding of plants and metal and stone. They explained how seasons worked, how the sky moved, and how the earth changed. For the first time, humans gained skills that transformed them from wandering tribes into builders of cities. Yet this gift came with consequences no one could have predicted. Some Watchers became fascinated with human emotions and desires. Some formed bonds with humans that went far beyond teaching. And the children born from these unions became the Nephilim giants of incredible power, whose presence frightened both humans and heaven. When the early church later encountered this story, they did not see teachers or guides or beings of light. They saw a threat to their authority. They recast the descent as a fall into evil, and the Watchers as demons who corrupted humanity. The original brightness of these beings was replaced with monstrous imagery. Their knowledge became forbidden. Their legacy was rewritten. But the truth hidden in the oldest stories is far more complex. The forbidden descent was not the rise of demons. It was the moment heavenly beings chose to walk beside humans, and in doing so, changed the world forever. When the Watchers stepped into the human world, they did not arrive with swords or threats. They arrived with knowledge. Knowledge so advanced and so transformative that ancient people believed they were being taught by beings from the very heart of the sky. The oldest stories say the Watchers did not simply watch over humanity like distant guardians. They walked among early humans. They sat with them. They taught them. And what they taught was nothing less than the foundation of civilization itself. One Watcher, named Azazel, showed humans how to shape metal. Until that moment, people used stone and bone for tools. But with metal came strength and power. Blades became sharper, farming tools became stronger. Entire communities could grow faster than ever before. Metalwork was a turning point in human history, and the Watchers sparked it long before humans could have learned it on their own. Another group of Watchers taught astronomy. They explained the movement of the stars and the purpose of the constellations. They taught early humans how to track time by the sky, how to predict seasons, and how the heavens moved in cycles. This changed everything. Suddenly farming became easier. Navigation became possible. People could understand their place in the universe not through fear but through knowledge. Others taught writing. This was one of the most powerful gifts of all. Before writing, humans depended on memory and stories passed by voice. But writing allowed knowledge to travel across generations without being changed or forgotten. It allowed kings to create laws. It allowed priests to record visions. It allowed people to build cultures that lasted more than a single lifetime. The Watchers also shared healing practices. They taught the secrets of plants and herbs and natural remedies. They explained how the body worked and how sickness could be treated. This was so advanced for the ancient world that many later rulers believed it had to be supernatural. Piece by piece, the Watchers gave humanity tools that would normally take thousands of years to discover. But not every Watcher stayed focused on teaching. Some became fascinated with human emotions and desires. Some stepped deeper into human life than they were ever meant to. And this mixture of knowledge and attachment led to outcomes that spun out of control. When the early church encountered these ancient stories, they faced a massive problem. If humans learned writing, astronomy, architecture, healing, and metalwork from the Watchers, then humanity did not need the church to access truth. If the first teachers were not human and not angels from Christian doctrine, then the church could not claim to be the only bridge between heaven and earth. And if the Watchers gave knowledge freely, then knowledge itself was divine long before any religious authority existed. To maintain control, the church rebranded these teachings as forbidden arts. They claimed the Watchers corrupted humanity instead of enlightening it. They rewrote the story so the gifts of the Watchers became tools of temptation and rebellion. But the ancient texts say something very different. They describe a moment when the human mind opened, a moment when the world transformed, a moment when knowledge arrived from the sky and nothing was ever the same again. From the moment the Watchers shared their knowledge with early humans, the balance of power on earth shifted in a way later religious authorities could never fully undo. In ancient times, people believed knowledge came from the sky. It came from radiant beings who walked among them and taught them the secrets of metal, the patterns of the stars, the power of written words, and the hidden healing inside plants. Humanity grew stronger, wiser, and more independent with each lesson. But this created a problem that would echo through history. When a person understands the world, they fear less. When they can read, they can question. When they can heal themselves, they do not depend on priests. When they know the stars, they do not need a church to tell them how the universe works. Knowledge is power, and the Watchers gave that power directly to humanity, without permission, without control, and without asking for worship. That single act became the quiet threat that shaped the Vatican's attitude toward ancient stories of the Watchers for centuries. When the early church rose to power in Europe, it was not just a spiritual institution. It was the center of education, government, and culture. People were taught that only priests could interpret sacred knowledge. Only priests could speak to the divine. Only priests could guide souls towards salvation. But the ancient stories of the Watchers shattered that idea. These tales described a time when humanity learned directly from beings of light with no priest in between. It suggested that wisdom did not belong to any institution, but to anyone willing to learn, and that made the church deeply uncomfortable. So a slow and deliberate campaign began. First, the Watchers were reframed as rebels. Their teachings were rebranded as forbidden. Their dissent was rewritten as a fall into evil. Then the word demon was attached to them, transforming radiant instructors into monstrous enemies. The Vatican understood something powerful about human psychology. If you want people to forget a truth, you do not erase it. You bury it under fear. You replace it with a story so terrifying that no one dares question it. And that is exactly what happened. Knowledge that once empowered humanity was now described as dangerous. Practices that lifted civilizations were recast as dark arts. Anyone who studied the old writings was marked as suspicious. Anyone who searched for the truth was warned that they were stepping into the territory of demons. Even the Book of Enoch was removed because it painted the Watchers in a light too close to admiration and too far from obedience. But the real fear behind the Vatican's actions was not the Watchers themselves. It was what humans could become if they remembered who their first teachers were. A humanity that gains knowledge from the sky is a humanity that cannot be controlled by the ground. A humanity that learns freely is a humanity that cannot be ruled through ignorance. The church needed people to believe that wisdom flowed downward from priests, not upward from the heavens. And so the story was rewritten. The Watchers were demonized. The truth was buried. And the world was taught to fear the very beings who once lifted humanity from the dust. In the oldest stories told by the earliest civilizations, the Watchers were described with awe. They were beings of light, towering figures who shone like fire and carried themselves with a calm and powerful presence. People did not imagine them with claws or twisted faces or burning wings. They imagined them the way they saw them, as radiant teachers from the sky who came not to harm but to guide. Yet when the early church began shaping its own version of the past, something disturbing happened. These shining ones were slowly transformed into nightmares. Their bright forms were reshaped into twisted shadows. Their wisdom was turned into wickedness. Their names became warnings. It was one of the most deliberate rebrandings in history, a slow turning of angels into monsters. But this transformation did not happen overnight. It began quietly in the early centuries after the fall of Rome, when the church realized that stories of the Watchers were dangerous to the authority they were building. If people believed their ancestors learned wisdom from heavenly beings outside the church, then the church could not claim to be the only doorway to truth. If humans once walked beside celestial teachers, then priests were not the only link between heaven and earth. And if the Watchers had once given knowledge to humanity, then knowledge itself did not need to be controlled by anyone. So the story needed to change. First, the Watchers were labelled as fallen, a word meant to suggest rebellion and betrayal instead of curiosity and compassion. Then their gifts were reframed as forbidden secrets meant to lead humans away from God. Suddenly, writing astronomy, healing, and metalwork were no longer gifts from the sky, but traps set by corrupt spirits. The Watchers were no longer described as glowing figures of wisdom. They were redrawn in manuscripts as dark winged creatures crouching in misery. Their radiant faces were replaced with twisted snarls. Their towering forms were deformed into hunched shapes. Fear became the new language of their identity. By the Middle Ages, this rebranding was complete. Artists painted demons with shapes meant to terrify villagers. Priests described them with words meant to keep people obedient. The Watchers were erased from memory, replaced by monstrous beings who crawled in shadows and sought only to destroy. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. It allowed the church to control the story of good and evil. It allowed them to claim that all wisdom outside their walls was dangerous. It allowed them to say that any knowledge not approved by them came from demons. With this new image in place, no one dared to question the past. No one dared to ask why ancient civilizations remembered the Watchers as beautiful and powerful instead of horrifying. No one dared to wonder whether something had been taken from them. But the truth did not disappear, it simply went quiet. Beneath the layers of fear and doctrine, the oldest stories still whisper that the beings later called demons were not always creatures of darkness. They were once the brightest lights in the sky, and someone needed them to be forgotten. In the ancient world, there were stories whispered around fires, stories carved into stone and passed from one generation to the next about beings who were not fully human and not fully divine. These beings were called the Nephilim. They were known as the children of heaven, the offspring of the Watchers and early human women. Their existence shook the world so deeply that even today their memory refuses to fade. According to the oldest texts, the Nephilim were giants in both size and presence. They walked the earth with strength that scared early humans and wisdom that rivaled the rulers of old kingdoms. They were described as tall figures with powerful bodies and eyes that glowed like the stars their fathers came from. They were not evil by nature, but they were different, and that difference changed everything. The Book of Enoch says the Watchers never planned for their children to become a problem. But with their incredible power and unmatched intelligence, the Nephilim began to shape the world faster than humans could control. Some became leaders, some became warriors, some became protectors, and some became feared. Their size alone made them legendary. Tales from cultures across the world speak of giants, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Celts, even tribes in the Americas. They all describe enormous beings who lived long ago and left behind marks that humans still cannot explain. Strange bones once displayed in old museums. Stone structures too large for normal humans to build. Tools made for hands far bigger than ours. Pathways carved from rock that would have required incredible strength. These traces appear everywhere, yet the Church refuses to acknowledge them as evidence. The official explanation is always the same. It is myth, it is exaggeration, it is symbolism. Anything except the possibility that the Nephilim may have actually walked the earth. But why does the Church resist this idea so strongly? The answer lies in what the Nephilim represent. If the Nephilim existed, then the Watchers existed. If the Watchers existed, then humanity once learned directly from celestial beings outside the control of any religious authority. And if the Nephilim were real, then the timeline of human history is far more complex than anything taught in traditional doctrine. Admitting their existence would unravel centuries of careful storytelling. It would force the Church to explain why they removed the Book of Enoch, why they demonized the Watchers, and why they insisted for so long that humanity was alone and guided only through them. So the Nephilim were pushed into the realm of myth. Their stories were softened and their memories blurred until only fragments remained in old scriptures. Yet the world still remembers. In dusty deserts, In remote mountains, in forgotten caves, there are carvings of towering men with long hair and shining eyes. There are legends of sky-born warriors who helped build ancient cities. There are remains of people far larger than those who came after them. The children of heaven were never just a story. They were a part of human history that someone wanted erased. And every uncovered clue brings us a little closer to remembering what the world once knew. In almost every ancient civilization there is a story about a great flood, a massive event that covered the earth in water and wiped out nearly everything that lived. People today often think of it as a simple tale of moral punishment, a moment when humanity became too corrupt and the world needed to be washed clean. But when you look closely at the oldest versions of the story, something far more unsettling begins to appear. The flood was not just about human behavior. It was about removing an entire group of beings the world was never meant to keep. According to the Book of Enoch and other ancient writings, the Watchers descended from the sky and taught humanity secrets that were far ahead of their time. Their children, the Nephilim, grew into giants with incredible strength and intelligence. They shaped early civilizations and built structures that even today seem almost impossible. But as their numbers grew, something changed. The world could no longer contain them. Their presence began to disturb the balance of life on Earth. The Watchers had crossed a forbidden boundary, and now the consequences were spreading. The ancient texts say that heaven saw the Nephilim as a threat not only to humans, but to the stability of the world itself. These giants were not meant to exist. They were the result of two different realms colliding. So a decision was made. The world would be reset. Water would become the weapon. And history, as humans, knew it would begin again. When the church later took control of these stories, they softened the message. They said the flood was about sin and punishment, about cleansing the world of bad behavior. But the earliest stories do not focus on human wickedness. They focus on the Watchers and their children. They focus on knowledge that spread too fast and beings who grew too powerful. They describe a world that needed to be restarted because it had moved beyond what humans alone could handle. This idea becomes even more convincing when you look at global flood myths. Civilizations that never met each other all tell the same story. A world destroyed by water, giants wiped out, a new era beginning afterward. It sounds less like a moral tale and more like a coordinated event recorded by people across the entire planet. Many researchers believe that the flood was used to erase evidence of the Watchers and the Nephilim. Their structures, their technology, their records, and even their bodies would be buried under layers of mud and ocean. After the waters receded, humans would rebuild, but without the towering teachers who once walked beside them. This would give new leaders a chance to take control of knowledge. From that moment forward, the story of the Watchers would be rewritten. Their children would be remembered as myths, and the true purpose of the flood would be hidden in symbolism and parables. The Vatican later supported this version because it served their timeline and placed human history neatly under their control. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The Great Flood was not simply a punishment, it was a reset, a deliberate wiping of the board to remove forbidden hybrids and the advanced knowledge they carried. And if that knowledge was erased once, it makes you wonder what else was lost beneath those ancient waters. After the Great Flood, the world was supposed to be quiet. The ancient stories say the waters washed away, the giants erased the traces of forbidden knowledge, and ended the influence of the Watchers forever. But when you look at the oldest writings from different civilizations, something strange happens. The Watchers come back, not in the same form as before, and not in the same overwhelming numbers, but in small echoes, glimpses, and shadows that appear again and again in human history. It is almost as if the flood removed their physical presence, but not their desire to return. The Book of Enoch says that after the giants perished in the flood, their spirits remained on earth, wandering as restless beings caught between two realms. These spirits were said to whisper to humans, inspiring ideas and guiding certain individuals toward knowledge long thought lost. In early Hebrew stories, these beings were not described as demons the way the church later insisted. They were described as lingering watchers, beings tied to earth because their human and heavenly connections could not be fully erased. They were no longer towering giant teachers, but something more subtle, moving quietly in the background. In Mesopotamian writings after the flood, certain kings claimed to receive wisdom from shining beings who appeared in dreams or visions. These rulers credited their victories and inventions not to their own skill, but to guidance from the sky. In Egypt, ancient records describe mysterious visitors who helped restore knowledge after a time of destruction. They taught architecture, healing, and astronomy as if continuing lessons interrupted by the flood. In Greece, stories began to emerge about gods and demigods returning in spiritual form after their physical age had ended. And in early Christian writings, there are warnings about spirits who still roam the world, whispering truths that humans were not meant to hear. All of these sources suggest the same idea. The Watchers did not fully vanish. They adapted, they changed their form. They moved from walking beside humans to influencing them from behind the veil. But this created a problem for the rising church. If the Watchers still existed in any way, then the church could not claim to be the only connection between humanity and the divine. If ancient knowledge continued to flow through visions, dreams, and unexplained encounters, then the official version of history could not hold. So the church began working to bury these echoes. Writings that mentioned the Watchers returning were labeled dangerous or symbolic. Stories that tied ancient kings to shining teachers were rewritten as myths. Any reference to spirits guiding humanity was reframed as demonic influence. The Watchers were pushed deeper and deeper into darkness until only the monstrous version remained. Yet traces of their return still appear in unexpected places. Medieval monks wrote about tall, glowing figures appearing to hermits in remote mountains. Indigenous tribes in the Americas recorded sky teachers who gave wisdom after a world-destroying flood. And modern researchers find symbols carved into stone showing beings that look nothing like demons and everything like the radiant figures from before the flood. The Watchers may not have returned in body, but their presence never fully left. Their knowledge, their influence, and their connection to humanity continued like a faint echo through the ages. And the church knew that if people realized this truth, the entire structure of spiritual control would crumble. That is why those echoes were hidden. That is why the Watchers became demons. And that is why the story continues to whisper through the cracks of history, waiting for someone willing to listen. Across the ancient world, civilizations separated by oceans and mountains told stories of powerful beings who descended from the sky. They were described as radiant, wise, and incredibly advanced. They taught humanity how to build cities, how to read the stars, and how to understand the hidden forces of nature. These beings were honored as gods by the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians. Yet when you compare their descriptions to the earliest stories of the Watchers, something surprising happens. They match almost perfectly. In Greek mythology, the gods lived on a high sacred mountain. They were tall, glowing, and capable of interacting with humans in both spiritual and physical ways. They taught heroes. They shaped kingdoms. They gave humans skills they could never have discovered alone. This sounds less like the monstrous demons the church later described, and more like the shining Watchers who descended on Mount Hermon. In Egypt, the gods were said to have sailed to earth from the stars. They brought writing, mathematics, architecture, and healing. They walked as rulers for a time, then passed their knowledge to priests before returning to the heavens. The god Thoth was credited with giving writing to humanity. The god Osiris taught agriculture and civilization after a great disaster. These stories echo the same pattern found in the Book of Enoch, where the Watchers shared forbidden knowledge and reshaped the world. In Mesopotamia, the gods were even more obviously connected to the Watchers. The Anunnaki and the Igigi were described as heavenly beings who shone with brightness and had the ability to move between realms. They guided the earliest kings and gave humans the foundations of society. They were not described as evil. They were described as teachers. When the early church encountered these myths, they faced a massive challenge. If the gods of the ancient world were actually memories of the Watchers, then the church could not claim to be the original source of spiritual truth. The world had already been shaped by heavenly beings long before Christianity existed. These beings brought knowledge without priests, without churches, and without religious control, so the church created a solution. They rebranded these gods as idols. They said the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians worshipped false beings. They said the shining figures of the past were demons in disguise. They insisted that any wisdom coming from these earlier civilizations was corrupted and dangerous. This rewriting did not happen quickly. It happened slowly over centuries. Priests told villagers that the old gods were tricksters. Artists painted them as horrible, twisted creatures. Scholars were forbidden to study their stories without permission. The Vatican needed the world to believe that all ancient wisdom outside the Bible came from darkness. It was the only way to protect their authority. But when you look at the oldest descriptions of these beings, their appearance, their behavior, and their teachings do not match demons at all. They match the Watchers, the same radiant beings who taught humanity before the flood, the same beings the church spent centuries trying to erase. So the question becomes clear. Were the gods of ancient civilizations truly false idols, or were they memories of the Watchers preserved in myth after the church tried to bury their existence? The truth hidden beneath thousands of years of storytelling may reveal that humanity's first gods were not gods at all. They were the fallen angels the Vatican quietly rebranded as monsters. Long before the church turned Lucifer into the ruler of hell, the ancient world knew him by a very different name. He was called the Light Bringer. In Latin, his name meant the morning star, the bright planet Venus that rises before dawn. He was not a monster. He was not the enemy of heaven. He was not described with horns or fire. In fact, the Bible never once connects Lucifer to Satan. That connection was created much later by theologians who needed a single villain powerful enough to carry the weight of all evil. The original story of Lucifer comes from a passage in the Book of Isaiah, written long before Christianity existed. It describes a fallen king of Babylon, a man whose pride brought him low. The word Lucifer was used as a poetic metaphor, not as the name of a spiritual being. It was about a human king bragging about rising to the heavens only to fall. There was no mention of rebellion against God. No watchers, no angels, no demons. Yet centuries later, the church transformed this poetic image into the story of a powerful angel who challenged heaven and was cast down. This new version did not come from ancient scripture. It came from medieval imagination. Early Christian writers struggled to explain why evil existed if God was all-powerful. They needed a beginning. They needed a source. They needed someone to blame. So they combined several unrelated characters. They took the serpent from the Garden of Eden. They took the accuser, known as Satan, from the Book of Job. They took the poetic metaphor of Lucifer, the morning star. They took stories of rebellious angels hinted at in the Book of Enoch. Then they merged them all into one single enemy. Satan became Lucifer. Lucifer became the devil. And the devil became the ultimate villain of Christianity. This new figure was powerful, terrifying, and easy to fear, but he was nothing like the original morning star described in Scripture. That version of Lucifer was symbolic, a warning about pride, not a supernatural monster. The Watchers, on the other hand, were real beings mentioned in many ancient texts. They had descended from heaven. They had broken divine rules. They had interacted with humanity in ways the church wanted forgotten. These stories were dangerous. because they suggested multiple heavenly beings played roles in human history, not just one rebel. To keep control over spiritual narrative, the church needed a simpler story. One villain, one fall, one enemy. So they took bits and pieces from older myths and fused them into the figure we now imagine. Medieval theologians painted Lucifer with dark wings and horns and fire, even though none of those details appear in the Bible. Painters added more fear. Priests added more warnings. And the real identity of the morning star vanished behind a mask of terror. The greatest irony is that the name Lucifer meant light bearer, a symbol of enlightenment, curiosity, and the search for truth. But once the church turned him into the face of evil, anything connected to knowledge outside their control became suspicious or forbidden. The true Lucifer was not a devil. He was a symbol of light, and that made him far more threatening to those who ruled through darkness. Among all the watchers named in the ancient stories, only one was singled out with a level of fear and precision that almost feels personal. His name was Azazel. Unlike the others who taught humans in groups or guided them quietly, Azazel stepped forward boldly. He shared knowledge that transformed early civilizations, and he did it without hiding. The Book of Enoch says that Azazel taught humanity the secrets of metal. He showed them how to shape swords, how to forge armor, and how to build tools that changed the course of human power. He revealed the art of crafting mirrors and jewelry and dyes, things that allowed humans to express beauty and identity. He taught them the patterns of the heavens, how to read the movement of stars and understand the passage of time. In other words, Azazel gave humanity the keys to power, creation, and self-expression. He gave them the ability to defend themselves, to build societies, to count seasons, and to understand their world without leaning on priests or rituals. For early humans, this was a gift. For later religious authorities, it was a problem. What Azazel represented more than anything was independence. He did not demand to be worshipped. He did not claim to be a god. He acted as a teacher, a guide, a being who believed humanity could rise further than anyone expected. But his teachings broke the rules of heaven and triggered consequences that echoed for thousands of years. According to the old texts, Azazel's influence spread so widely that the world changed faster than the divine powers wanted. Humans were not meant to learn certain arts so quickly. They were not meant to wield such strength without guidance. And so Azazel was punished in a way no other watcher was. He was bound in darkness until the final judgment, an eternity of silence for daring to uplift humanity. This story alone would have been powerful. But the church took it much further. When Christian doctrine began forming in the early centuries, the figure of Azazel was too dangerous to leave untouched. A heavenly being who empowered humans did not fit the message that all knowledge must flow through the church. A teacher who gave humans independence challenged the idea that people needed spiritual leaders to survive. So the identity of Azazel was erased, twisted, and buried. First, his name was transformed into a symbol of evil. Later it was connected to the idea of a scapegoat, an animal sent into the wilderness, bearing the sins of a community. With that one ritual, the memory of Azazel shifted from teacher to cursed being. Then medieval theologians rewrote him entirely, turning him into a demon without light or wisdom. His ancient teachings were labelled forbidden arts. His influence was described as corruption. His story was sealed in text the church banned for more than 1,000 years. But even with this intense suppression, traces of Azazel remain. Ancient Jewish traditions describe him not as a monster, but as a powerful figure cast out for revealing truths too soon. Archaeological discoveries show early metallurgy emerging suddenly, as if taught, not discovered. Star maps older than expected hint at knowledge far beyond what ancient people should have known. Each fragment points back to the same figure, the only watcher named, with both admiration and fear. Azazel was not erased because he was evil. He was erased because he made humanity strong. For most people, the story of the fallen angels seems simple. They disobeyed heaven and became evil. That is the version repeated in churches, the version written in catechisms, and the version echoed in sermons for centuries. But behind closed doors, within the walls of monasteries, and deep in the archives, where only trained scholars were allowed, a very different conversation once took place. Early popes and theologians did not all agree that the fallen angels were evil. Some believed they were disobedient but not corrupted. Others argued they were punished too severely. And a few went so far as to say these beings were closer to ancient teachers than demonic monsters. These debates never reached the public. They were hidden under what scholars now call the Vatican's shadow doctrine, the private writings that reveal what the Church truly wrestled with. In letters dated around the early centuries after the fall of Rome, certain Church fathers admitted that the angels described in the Book of Enoch showed compassion. They acted out of curiosity, not rebellion. One letter describes them as guardians who became too close to those they were meant to watch over. Another describes them as beings who loved humanity more than heaven wanted them to. None of these early writings called them demons. That label came centuries later. Some popes even debated whether the Watchers were punished for their actions or for teaching humans too much too early. If the second reason is true, then the Watchers were not enemies of heaven, but whistleblowers, punished for empowering humans. This idea was disturbing for the Church because it suggested that knowledge itself was the issue. And if knowledge was the forbidden fruit, then the Church would need to control it very carefully. As the Middle Ages approached, the tone of these internal writings began to change. Popes started to realize that allowing people to believe fallen angels were simply disobedient beings would weaken the authority of the Church. If the Watchers had been teachers, then priests were no longer the only guides. If they fell because they loved humanity, then the Church could not preach fear without contradiction. So slowly the narrative shifted. Writings that painted the Watchers in a sympathetic light were locked away. Scrolls describing them as radiant beings were hidden, sometimes copied only in parts, sometimes not copied at all. New theologians rewrote their identity, transforming them from curious instructors into dangerous tempters. A pope from the early medieval period wrote a warning that if the public ever viewed the fallen angels as merely disobedient, it would lead to chaos because people would question the need for spiritual authority. That line alone reveals everything. The Church understood that their power relied on shaping the story of good and evil. They could not allow a version where the Watchers acted from love or curiosity or a desire to help humanity. They needed a clean divide between heaven and rebellion, obedience and sin, priest and outsider. And so the shadow doctrine was sealed. The public story became absolute. The Watchers were now demons. Their children were monsters. Their teachings were evil. Yet deep in the Vatican's hidden archives, the older writings still exist. They describe a world where angels were not perfect and where disobedience was not always wicked. They describe a moment when the Church nearly admitted that the fallen angels might have been something very different from the monsters we know today. There was a moment in history when the Church made a decision that would echo across every generation that followed. A moment when ancient stories were erased, when angelic roles were rewritten, and when the line between light and darkness was redrawn by human hands. It happened quietly during the early centuries of Christianity, long before medieval cathedrals touched the sky, and long before the Vatican became the center of global religion. Yet what was decided in that hidden gathering shaped how billions of people would understand angels, demons, and the unseen world forever. This was the council that changed everything. In those early years, the Book of Enoch was still widely read. Many Christians accepted it as scripture. Some even believed it contained the clearest explanation for why evil existed on earth. It described the Watchers in detail as radiant beings who descended voluntarily. It described their children, the Nephilim, who became giants and heroes. And it described how forbidden knowledge spread across the world. But this book also contained something the church could not accept. It said the Watchers taught humanity directly. It said angels could disobey for reasons other than wickedness. It said knowledge did not need a priest to flow. That idea alone threatened the rising authority of the church. So during a gathering of bishops and early theologians, leaders debated the future of the Book of Enoch. Some argued it was too strange. Others argued it clashed with the clean narrative they wanted. A few admitted privately that it made the angels look too human and the humans look too independent. In the end, the decision was made. Enoch would be removed. It would not be copied. It would not be taught. It would not be read in churches again. The next issue was even larger. The ancient world was filled with stories of heavenly beings who acted with freedom and emotion. But the church wanted order. They wanted a structure that made sense. They wanted angels who obeyed without question. They wanted demons who were unquestionably evil. So the angelic hierarchy was rewritten. Seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, angels. A neat list created by scholars, not prophets. A structure designed to look divine but built to create obedience. And at the bottom of this new order, beneath everything else, they placed the fallen angels. Not as teachers, not as rebels with purpose, but as demons. A single label meant to erase their past, their radiance, and their connection to humanity. This council agreed that every angel who disobeyed must be described as entirely evil. No exceptions, no complexity, no sympathy. The Watchers became the enemy. Their names were erased from sermons. Their stories were replaced with warnings. The Nephilim became legends or lies, and the church gained complete control over the spiritual narrative. The world never knew this council happened. It was not recorded openly in history books, but its consequences shaped every painting of angels, every sermon about demons, and every belief about the unseen world. Because once the church rewrote the heavens, there was no going back. They had taken the story of ancient beings of light and sealed it beneath a single word meant to erase them forever: demons. For centuries, the church controlled words, rewrote scriptures, and shaped doctrine. But there was one thing they could not fully control: art. Paintings from the early Middle Ages hold a truth the Vatican never intended the world to see. A truth that slipped through the cracks of censorship and survived on the walls of cathedrals and in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. These paintings reveal that fallen angels were not always shown as monsters. In fact, for hundreds of years after Christianity began to spread, fallen angels were painted almost exactly like the Watchers described in the Book of Enoch: tall, glowing, and overwhelmingly beautiful. Their faces were calm. Their halos still shone. Their wings were bright. Their presence looked powerful, not corrupted. To the people of that time, this was normal. The earliest Christians had not yet been taught to fear the Watchers. They still remembered stories that described heavenly beings who walked among humans. They knew the legends of the sons of God who took human wives, the radiant figures who taught early civilizations, and the giants who came from their union. So artists naturally painted them as they had been told: tall, luminous beings descending from the sky like pillars of fire. But as the church tightened its grip on doctrine, something began to change. Priests wanted people to believe fallen angels were evil from the moment they disobeyed heaven. They wanted the Watchers to be symbols of corruption, not curiosity. They wanted to erase their role as teachers, so the images needed to change. Around the time of the 9th century, you can see the shift begin. Paintings start to dull the brightness of fallen angels. Their wings become darker, their faces become stern, their bodies shrink, but they are still unmistakably heavenly beings, not demons. By the 12th century, the church wanted total control over the story. Sermons preached that fallen angels were hideous creatures. Artists were pressured to change their work to match the new doctrine, and the transformation grew more dramatic. Glowing figures slowly turned into twisted shapes. Beautiful faces became snarling masks. Wings became bat-like instead of feathered. Halos disappeared entirely. By the 15th century, the watchers were gone. The beings painted before had been erased, replaced by monstrous creatures crawling in darkness. Yet, in the early paintings, still hanging in forgotten monasteries and old European churches, the truth remains. These images are not accidents. They are visual proof that the story changed. They capture the moment before the rebranding, when fallen angels were still recognized as beings of light, not demons. One medieval scholar even complained in a preserved letter that artists were painting fallen angels too beautifully, saying this would confuse the public. He warned that if people saw them as radiant, they might ask questions the church did not want answered. That letter reveals more than he intended. It shows that the church knew the original stories. It shows they were aware that the Watchers had once been revered, and it shows they needed the world to forget that history. Art became the battlefield where truth and doctrine collided. And despite the church's best efforts, some paintings still whisper the old story. The Watchers were never monsters. They were beings of light. And the Vatican's long campaign to hide that truth is still visible on the canvas for anyone willing to look closely. During the Middle Ages, a quiet but deadly war was unfolding in the shadows of Europe. It was not a war fought with swords or armies. It was a war fought with ideas. A war against anyone who dared to study the ancient stories of the Watchers, the Nephilim, or the forgotten angelic orders that existed long before Christianity. The church called it heresy. But in reality it was a campaign to erase every trace of pre-Christian angelology and the cosmic history that threatened the neat narrative the Vatican had built. The Inquisition is often remembered as a hunt for witches or sorcerers, yet many of its earliest victims were scholars. Not dark magicians, not rebels, but educated men who studied ancient texts from Sumer, Babylon, Greece, and early Hebrew tradition. These scholars saw connections the church did not want revealed. They noticed that the beings described as gods, messengers, or shining ones were almost identical to the Watchers. They realized that humanity once believed in multiple types of angels, some who served humans, some who taught them, and some who walked beside them freely. They understood that the fallen angels were not originally monsters, but beings who crossed forbidden boundaries, and the more they studied, the more dangerous they became. For the church, the threat was not that the scholars were wrong, the threat was that they were right. If people learned that pre-Christian civilizations described the same heavenly beings found in the Book of Enoch, they might start asking questions the Vatican feared. Why were these records erased? Why did ancient stories match so closely? Why did the church declare all fallen angels evil when older texts told a very different story? So the Inquisition expanded its mission. Anyone researching angelic hierarchies outside of church approval was accused of attempting to summon spirits. Anyone translating ancient cosmology was said to be practicing forbidden arts. Anyone comparing Enoch's Watchers with Greek or Mesopotamian gods was labelled a danger to the faith. At first, the punishments were warnings and forced recantations. But by the time the 13th century arrived, the consequences had grown far more brutal. Scholars were arrested in the middle of the night and dragged before secret tribunals. They were questioned for hours about their studies. Who taught you these things? What texts did you read? Who else knows? They were accused of speaking with demons, simply for pointing out that ancient civilizations described angels who were radiant and powerful. Many never returned from those rooms. Some were imprisoned for life in monasteries. Some were tortured until they confessed to imaginary crimes. Others were executed publicly as warnings to anyone who dared look into the past too deeply. The most tragic part is that many of these scholars were not trying to challenge the church. They were trying to understand the truth about humanity's origins. They wanted to know why so many stories spoke of beings from the sky. They wanted to know what was lost when Enoch was banned. They wanted to know what the world once believed before it was forbidden to remember. But to the Vatican, knowledge was dangerous when it did not pass through their hands. Angelic cosmology was too close to the original story of the Watchers, too close to the truth they had worked to bury. And so the Inquisition became more than a religious court. It became a shield protecting a rewritten history, a weapon used to silence anyone who dared to ask where the angels really came from. Because sometimes the greatest threat to power is not rebellion, it is remembering. Deep beneath the polished floors of the Vatican, where tourists walk and cameras flash, there is a world almost no one has seen. A world of locked doors, stone corridors and vaults sealed so tightly that even many priests have never entered them. For centuries, whispers have spread about what lies hidden there. Not treasure, not gold, but manuscripts. Ancient writings so old and so powerful that revealing them could shake the foundations of history and religion. These manuscripts are said to contain the original stories of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the celestial science that existed long before the Church rewrote the heavens. People imagine the Vatican archives as a giant library filled with shelves and dust. But the most important sections are nothing like that. They are underground chambers guarded by layers of permission keys and security. Only a handful of scholars in the entire world have ever been allowed inside, and even they can only request specific documents, never wander freely, and never ask for anything the Church does not approve. What lies beyond those restricted doors is where the real secrets wait. Ancient Hebrew scrolls, far older than the versions found in common Bibles. Sumerian tablets describing star maps and heavenly beings who descended to earth. Early Christian writings that mention the Watchers by name and describe their radiance without calling them demons. Even medieval reports of discoveries the Church punished or silenced. Some researchers claim that hidden deep in these vaults are full copies of the Book of Enoch, preserved perfectly even though the Church banned it for more than 1,000 years. Others whisper about manuscripts written by early monks, who admitted privately that the fallen angels were not evil but simply disobedient. There are also rumours of ancient cosmology texts explaining how the Watchers taught humans to measure the stars and understand the movement of the heavens. If these writings are real, then they would prove that humanity knew advanced celestial science long before the Church claimed such knowledge was revealed through divine inspiration. And perhaps most shocking are the whispers about Nephilim records. These include measurements of giant skeletons found in Europe during the early Middle Ages, drawings of massive humanoid bones, and reports from priests who witnessed things that directly contradicted official doctrine. Instead of releasing this information, the Church confiscated it, sealed it away, and declared the findings too dangerous for public knowledge. Why hide all this? The answer is simple. The truth inside those manuscripts could undo the narrative the Vatican has protected for centuries. If the Watchers were not demons, then much of Christian demonology would collapse. If the Nephilim were real, then biblical stories, long dismissed as symbolic, would suddenly become historical. If ancient humans learned from radiant beings, instead of receiving all wisdom through the church, then spiritual authority would shift away from Rome entirely. And if early civilizations had celestial science far beyond their time, then the world would realize that history is not a straight line, but a puzzle with missing pieces. Those missing pieces might still be sitting on shelves in the deepest part of the archives, untouched for centuries, waiting for the moment humanity is finally ready to face the truth about its own origins. Until then, the vaults stay locked and the whispers continue, because secrets do not disappear. They only wait. Across the vast lands of the Americas, long before Europeans arrived, ancient tribes spoke of beings who came from the sky. These beings were not described as monsters or demons. They were remembered as teachers, guides, and radiant visitors who shaped early civilizations. And when you compare these stories to the Watchers of the Old World, the similarities are almost impossible to ignore. The Maya told stories of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, a being who descended from the heavens to teach humans astronomy, architecture, and the secrets of time. He was never described as evil. He was described as a bringer of knowledge, the same role the Watchers played in the Book of Enoch. The Aztecs had Quetzalcoatl, another sky-born teacher, who was said to be tall, pale, and radiant with feathered wings. He taught writing and science, and promised to return one day. His presence transformed their entire civilization. His description matches the Shining Ones, mentioned in ancient Hebrew and Mesopotamian texts. In the Andes, the Inca told stories of Viracocha, a mysterious god who walked among humans as a wise instructor. According to legend, he appeared after a great flood when the world was in chaos. He restored knowledge, rebuilt the world, and taught the people how to survive. This mirrors the stories of Watchers who reappeared in spirit form after the flood, according to the Book of Enoch. In North America, many tribes described encounters with sky beings who descended in glowing forms. The Hopi spoke of the Kachina beings, luminous visitors from the heavens who taught agriculture, healing, and star lore. The Cherokee had stories of the Nunahai-tall radiant figures who lived in hidden mountains and protected humans. Even the Lakota described White Buffalo Calf Woman, a heavenly visitor who taught sacred rituals and brought advanced knowledge. These stories cross thousands of miles, yet share one remarkable detail. The visitors were always tall, glowing, and wise. They came from above. They taught humans skills they should not have had at that time. They promised to return. And in many cases, they left behind offspring described as giants, or powerful hybrids echoing the Nephilim of the Old World. When Spanish missionaries arrived in the 1400s and 1500s, they were shocked by how closely indigenous myths matched the forbidden stories found in the banned Book of Enoch. Some priests wrote private letters saying the tribes taught ideas dangerously similar to those of the Watchers. Their solution was predictable. They labelled the sky teachers as demons and insisted the feathered serpent gods were false. They destroyed sacred texts and forbade indigenous people from sharing their ancient stories. But the stories survived. They survived in carvings on stone pyramids, in paintings on pottery, in ceremonial dances, and in oral traditions passed down for centuries. And when all these stories are compared side by side, the pattern becomes clear. The Watchers did not belong to a single culture. Their memory reached every corner of the earth, including the New World, long before the Vatican tried to rewrite their past. Across the Americas, the truth was never erased. Humans once learned from heavenly beings. Giants once walked among them. And the sky was once far closer than the church ever wanted people to believe. In the oldest stories of the ancient world, there were beings of light who walked the earth long before the rise of kings or empires. They were not rebels. They were not punished. They were not cast out of heaven. These beings never fell. They came with purpose, taught with patience, and returned to the sky when their work was done. Yet when the Vatican began shaping the official narrative of angels and demons, even these luminous figures were pushed into the shadows. They were recast as deceivers or demonic spirits, not because of anything they did, but because their existence clashed with the story the church wanted the world to believe. These beings appear in nearly every ancient civilization. In Mesopotamia, they were the apkallu, 7 wise sages sent by the gods to guide humanity after creation. They taught writing, agriculture, and architecture. They were described as guardians, not rebels. In early Hebrew writings, they are hinted at as the holy watchers, distinct from the ones who disobeyed. These watchers never sinned, never descended illegally, and never went against the divine order. They were the protectors of nations, the ones who kept humanity safe during times of chaos. In Greek tradition, beings of light called daimonians served as guides to philosophers and kings. They were not evil in the original stories. They were wise spirits, assigned to help humans make better choices. But the church later twisted the word daimonian into demon, turning every guiding spirit into a threat. In Egypt, divine messengers walked among the people, teaching ritual astronomy, architecture, and moral law. They were called Netjeru, helpers of humanity. They were never described as fallen or wicked. They simply existed in harmony with the world. The problem for the Vatican was simple. If these beings existed and were not fallen, then the Church could not claim that all non-biblical spiritual encounters came from demons. If ancient civilizations learned from good heavenly beings outside the Church, then Christianity was not the only path to divine wisdom. And if humans once received guidance without priests, then priestly authority was no longer absolute, so the Church chose to rewrite them. The apkallu became suspicious, half-fish creatures, connected to forbidden knowledge. The Holy Watchers became confused with the fallen ones, until no distinction remained. The daimonian of Greek wisdom was twisted into a terrifying creature of darkness. Egyptian messengers were dismissed as pagan idols. The goal was not to erase these beings from memory, but to corrupt their identity. If people feared them, they would turn to the church for safety. If people doubted their goodness, they would reject the ancient teachings they carried. Over time, these once respected beings of light were grouped under the same label as the fallen angels. They were presented as deceivers trying to lead humanity astray. Their knowledge became forbidden. Their stories were dismissed as superstition. Yet, if you return to the original texts, something extraordinary becomes clear. These beings were never enemies. They were guardians. They were teachers. They were the ones who stood on the boundary between heaven and earth to guide humanity. They were the angels who never fell, and their quiet erasure reveals just how far the Vatican was willing to go to protect a single story of good and evil, even if it meant turning the brightest figures of ancient history into shadows. When European explorers pushed into the far corners of the world during the 1400s and 1500s, they expected to find new lands, new animals, and new people. What they did not expect was to hear the same ancient story repeated across oceans by tribes who had never heard of Christianity or the Bible. Again and again, missionaries wrote in their journals that the people they met claimed to descend from beings who came from the sky. Not gods, not spirits, sky beings. Tall, radiant teachers who arrived long before human memory and shaped their civilizations. These reports terrified the church. Not because the tribes believed something different, but because their stories sounded exactly like the Watchers described in the banned Book of Enoch. Early explorers were required to send written accounts back to Rome. Many of those reports survive only because copied fragments slipped into private collections. They describe tribes in the Amazon who believed their ancestors were taught by tall, luminous visitors with glowing skin. They describe Native American nations who said their laws and rituals were given to them by beings who descended from the stars. They describe tribes in the Pacific who said the sky people taught them navigation so advanced that even Europeans could not understand it. One missionary wrote that the people of a certain island refused to convert because they already believed their teachers came from above, not from Rome. Another wrote that a group of elders in the Caribbean described a great flood, followed by the return of radiant visitors who helped humanity rebuild. These stories matched the ancient accounts of the Watchers too perfectly. And that was the problem. If people across the world all shared memories of sky beings, then the Watchers were not legends from one culture. They were part of human history, a part the Vatican desperately wanted hidden. So Rome acted quickly. A secret system was created where missionaries were ordered to send sensitive reports in sealed envelopes that only high-ranking clergy were allowed to open. Accounts describing sky beings were classified. Missionaries were warned not to repeat such information publicly. Some were reassigned to remote monasteries. Others disappeared from historical records altogether. When explorers returned home, the church encouraged them to describe indigenous beliefs as childish or confused. Anything except organized, ancient, or connected to heavenly visitors. The Vatican released public statements claiming that stories of sky beings were satanic illusions, even though many missionaries admitted privately that the tribes described them as beings of light, not darkness. Meanwhile, the real reports were locked away. Some are said to lie in the lower levels of the Vatican archives, far beneath the general library. These reports include detailed drawings of symbols carved into stone depicting tall winged figures standing beside early humans. They include stories from elders who claimed their ancestors were giants descended from star beings. They include maps marking places where sky teachers were said to have landed. If these reports were ever released, they would reveal that humans across the world remembered the same truth. Contact happened long before empires or religions. The Watchers were not a myth. They were a global phenomenon, and the Vatican knows this. That is why they buried the evidence. Because once the world realizes that ancient humanity learned from beings of light who needed no priests and no churches, the entire foundation of religious control begins to crumble. In the last few decades, something strange has been happening. It started quietly with unusual sightings in remote mountains and deserts. Then came the discoveries in ancient remains that scientists could not explain. And now, newly translated texts from forgotten civilizations are hinting at something even more unsettling. It feels as if the Watchers, the ancient beings of light who once walked beside humanity, might be stirring again. People around the world have reported encounters with tall, luminous figures seen at night near forests or isolated valleys. These figures do not act like ghosts or monsters. Witnesses describe them as calm, silent, and almost curious. Some say the figures glow faintly, not with fire, but with a pale, soft light that makes the air feel strange. Others claim the beings vanish instantly, as if stepping between worlds. These sightings match descriptions from the Book of Enoch and from civilizations that lived thousands of years ago. But sightings are only part of the story. Modern science has uncovered mysteries that no one expected. In several regions, researchers have discovered human remains with unusual height, bone thickness, or genetic markers that do not match surrounding populations. These individuals were much taller than normal humans, closer to the descriptions of the Nephilim. Some DNA samples contain anomalies scientists cannot classify, fragments that do not appear in any other human group. No one wants to say it publicly, but privately many researchers admit these traits seem ancient, almost as if they came from a lineage long thought erased. Then there are the texts. New translations of Sumerian tablets speak of shining beings who promise to return at the end of an age. Recently uncovered scrolls from the Middle East describe Watchers who would rise again when humanity reached a level of knowledge close to their own. Even in South America, newly studied glyphs depict tall, radiant figures descending during times of great change. All of this would be easy to dismiss if it appeared in isolation, but everything is surfacing at the same time. Strange sightings, unexplained DNA, ancient predictions, and a world entering an era of rapid transformation through technology and exploration. Some believe the Watchers always left a connection open. They stepped back, but never fully abandoned humanity. And now that humans are reaching into space, editing genetics, and unlocking secrets of reality, the Watchers may see this as a signal, a sign that the time of return is near. The Vatican certainly thinks something is happening. Reports have surfaced that church officials are quietly studying these sightings. Some priests have been instructed to observe but never acknowledge. Others have warned scholars not to connect modern events to ancient angelic lore. It is the same pattern seen throughout history. When truth rises, the church tries to bury it, yet the whispers are growing louder. The Watchers may not be returning in the same physical form as before. They may be appearing in flashes, in visions, in brief encounters that prepare humanity for something larger. The signs point to a possibility the world is not ready to face. The Watchers were never gone. They were waiting. And now the ancient teachers of humanity might be stepping back into the story they helped create. From the beginning of this story, one question has quietly followed every chapter. It hides beneath the tales of giants, beneath the forbidden teachings, beneath the rebranded myths and the rewritten heavens. It is the question the Vatican never wanted the world to ask. Who really fell? The Church taught for centuries that the Watchers were evil from the moment they stepped onto Earth. They said, these beings betrayed heaven, corrupted humanity, and released darkness into the world. But when you return to the oldest texts, something different appears. The Watchers did not descend to cause chaos. They descended because they cared. They saw humanity struggling in the early days of the world. They saw fear, hunger, confusion, and suffering. And instead of watching from a distance, they chose to help. These beings taught humans how to build cities instead of wandering endlessly. They taught writing so knowledge could survive across generations. They taught healing so sickness no longer controlled life. They taught astronomy so people could understand the world instead of fearing the sky. They taught metallurgy so humans could protect themselves and grow stronger. None of this is described as evil in the ancient stories. It is described as enlightenment. Yet, the Watchers broke a rule. They crossed a boundary of heaven set in place. They offered knowledge too early, too freely, and too powerfully. And that decision created consequences that shaped everything that followed. But does breaking a rule make someone evil? Or does it make them independent? The Vatican answered that question with fear. To maintain absolute authority, they needed a simple world. Angels obey, demons rebel, humans follow. Anything outside that pattern threatened their power. If people believed the Watchers were teachers, then they might also believe that divine wisdom could come from outside the church. If people believed the Watchers cared for humanity, then they might stop fearing the beings the church called demons. And if people believed knowledge was a gift instead of a danger, then the church could no longer control what people learned or questioned. So the fallen angels were recast as monsters. Their radiance was painted over with shadows. Their names were erased or twisted. Their children became myths. Their teachings became forbidden. But none of this changes the truth buried beneath the layers of doctrine. The Watchers did not fall into darkness. They fell into humanity. They stepped down into our world and paid a price for helping us rise. Maybe heaven punished them. Maybe the church feared them. Maybe history forgot them. But the oldest stories do not call them evil. They call them shining ones, wise ones, teachers, guardians. So when we reach the final question, who really fell, the answer becomes less clear. Perhaps the Watchers fell from heaven but rose in the hearts of the people they helped. And perhaps the real fall came later, when powerful men rewrote their story, twisted their legacy, and buried the truth beneath fear. In the end, the Watchers may not have fallen from grace. Humanity may have fallen from truth.